Hey there, students. Welcome back to Intensive Review. All aboard, all right, because we are about to hop on to a long train of abuses and usurpations. Never mind, trains didn't exist back then. I just like to blow this whistle. So anyway, let's begin. We're going to look at USHC 1.2, which is going to focus on the conflict between Parliament and the colonies. Now, keep in mind that I've already done a segment on this standard because we've got a lot to cover here. So I've done a previous segment, and then I'm going to finish up in this segment, and we're going to look specifically at this point at this long train of abuses and usurpations that Jefferson talks about in the Declaration of Independence. And we're going to look at this process that leads to the ultimate separation of the British and their 13 American colonies. So first of all, the French and Indian War happened from 1754 to 1763, and this represents a major turning point in the relationship between the mother country and the 13 colonies. Now, why is that the case? First of all, that wars cost money, all right? We know that from all of these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that have added a good bit to our deficit and subsequently the national debt that keeps on piling higher and higher. Well, the British were no different. When you look at the French and Indian War, you see the British national debt that is climbing. And the British are really kind of frustrated here because the way that they see it, that they fought this war partly to protect their colonies, and they want the colonies to help pay for it. And the other thing is that the British citizenry, they don't like standing armies. Remember, we were talking about the English Bill of Rights, and one of the things was a prohibition on standing armies. Well, the British are thinking, you know what? We could keep a standing army, but we can hide it in the colonies. And then we can get them to pay for it. And we'll get them to pay for it with taxes. Because after all, they need protection, right? From these troops. They're somehow necessary, even though the French have been defeated or something like that. But Parliament is going to enter into this conflict with the colonies, and it's going to start off with 3 taxes. Now, keep in mind, I try to keep this in groups of 3 whenever I can. So the 3 taxes in the 1760s. Now, what's important is not so much the exact year, but that you know that this starts in the 1760s, that you've got these different conflicts here. All right, now keep in mind that you've got the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts, each of which I'm going to talk about briefly individually. All right, now keep in mind that you've already had the Proclamation line of 1763 as well, which limited the colonists from going over the Appalachian Mountains. Now, keep in mind, this is kind of an insult to the colonists because it says really that it was your fault that this war started. If y'all hadn't been going west, then you wouldn't have gotten into it with the French and the Indians, all right? So you've got that proclamation line, but then you've got these 3 taxes. Now, first of all, smuggling. It was a serious problem. Now, we got a new Star Wars movie coming out, I think Christmas, and you're going to see Han Solo, famous smuggler on the Millennium Falcon. Now, this is a serious problem. John Hancock was a smuggler. A lot of people know him for his signature. They don't realize this guy made a lot of money smuggling, because what happened here was, although the colonists were not supposed to trade with other colonies, they did it anyway because it was cheaper and they could make money. So the Sugar Act was an import tax on foreign sugar. And what happened here was this tax was actually lower than the tax had been. But the difference is that they were collecting it. Remember the salutary neglect, that's over. So the British lower the taxes, but they say, well, we're going to collect it when we didn't collect the old one. And the colonists, especially the smuggling class, they're thinking, well, I'm paying more taxes now than when they were higher because you're collecting it. So in reality, it's a tax increase. Also sets up admiralty courts. When ships are captured, then they are brought before a British admiralty court and not brought before juries. So that's another thing, that the smugglers are really being thoroughly punished here in a way that they weren't beforehand. And keep in mind, jury trials, this is something that is guaranteed by the Magna Carta. This is set up to where you can lose your property if you are caught smuggling, and a jury is not going to take that property away from you. It'll be a British Admiralty court. And then in 1765, we've got the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act was especially controversial because it was an internal tax on legal documents. The colonists didn't really dispute Parliament's right to tax trade, but when it came to internal taxes, something like a sales tax or excise tax or something like that, then it was something that should be decided by the colonial legislatures. So what happened here in this Stamp Act was that if you wanted to get a legal document, let's say you're buying property, you're getting married, or you are getting a university degree or something like that, then you would need to print this on special paper with a stamp on it. And you had to pay a tax to get that paper. Now, the tax wasn't all that much, but it was not consented to. And this met with mass resistance in the sense of boycotts, not buying British goods, which that was kind of the whole trade thing, that the colonists export raw materials, then they bring in finished goods, but they weren't buying the finished goods. There was mob violence where people would break stuff. They'd demonstrate in the streets. They would tar and feather a tax collector or vandalize his house or something like that. You can see this stamp here that is a protest stamp printed in a paper. And this whole rallying cry of no taxation without representation, keep in mind that that goes back to the Magna Carta. That goes back to this idea that is enshrined in the British system. So keep in mind that these protests are rooted in respect for traditional English rights. And you see resistance in the form of the Sons of Liberty, who engaged in intimidation and mob violence, mass protests. You see these guys tarring and feathering a tax collector under the Liberty Tree. Now, of course, if you look at this document, you can see that it is from a royalist sort of point of view, that you see that you've got a noose there and the Sons of Liberty are being portrayed as kind of a lawless mob, which to a certain extent they are. Now, then there are the Daughters of Liberty. Now, the Daughters of Liberty are assisting in the boycott efforts by producing homespun fabric. And what they wanted to do was reduce dependence on British textiles. And what this was always like those people who shop at the thrift store, not because they can't afford to buy their clothes new, but because they want to be trendy or something like that. This was where that all kind of got started. We got some of you in here that fit that bill. And what happened here was that if you're wearing a nice British suit, that's a no-no. Even if you're George Washington or somebody rich like that, you should be wearing a suit of homespun cloth to show your patriotism. So the Daughters of Liberty are making this possible. And then we can see here that the Sons of Liberty are assembling in order to hear of the resignation of a tax collector who has no doubt been intimidated into this resignation. And the Stamp Act the following year is repealed, largely because British merchants are saying like, hey, we need this business, and if this is going to cut in our business, we need to get rid of it. But Parliament's not done. They are going to levy another tax on certain products. Now keep in mind this will be a trade tax, it won't be an internal tax, but the Townshend Acts are going to tax paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. It's just nice to remember those things. It's got a ring to it. So the Townshend Acts in 1767, another tax on imports, paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. And once again, you've got more protest and that sort of thing. And then we will see that there are British ships and all of that kind of stuff, and leading to the Boston Massacre, all right? In 1770, you see a confrontation between British troops and a rowdy mob, really a rowdy, lawless mob. And that's not portrayed as such in this engraving by Paul Revere, that you see British troops all neatly lined up, firing upon a crowd which seems calm, which includes women and children and a dog that's, I don't know if it's a stray or something like that. You see behind the British soldiers where it says Butcher's Hall. Well, this was Paul Revere's propaganda, all right? This was not how it actually happened. How it actually happened was that this was at night, there was a mob, somebody yelled fire, stuff happens, all right? Now, the Townshend Acts are repealed in the light of the Boston Massacre with one exception, the tax on tea. Now, keep in mind here that when we look at these years, we see the Townshend Acts in 1767, then we see the Boston Massacre in 1770, and nothing else really happens until 1773. So the Boston Massacre is really kind of an isolated incident in the midst of all this. So you can really divide this into two phases, that you've seen Parliament tax the colonies, and that's kind of over. The revolution's not really inevitable yet, but then we start to see it heat up. All right, that Parliament keeps the tax on tea just to show that they can, that they are lifting taxes, but they are doing it kind of, hey, we're going to keep one tax there. And that tax is really what's going to kind of contribute to this. The chain of events that's going to lead to the revolution starts with the Tea Act, continues into the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, and then Lexington and Concord. All right, so the Tea Act is passed in 1773. And what this did is it gave the British East India Company, I believe, a monopoly on tea. And they were the only people who could sell it in the colonies. Now, this was good tea at a good price, but keep in mind that part of the American Revolution is about economic freedom. And if you're an American, you're thinking, hey, you're not doing me a favor here selling me this tea at low prices. That's good tea. Speaking of tea, just recharge a little bit. All right, but this is a monopoly, and Parliament is telling the colonies how they will run their economy. And this leads to the Boston Tea Party, which is an act of vandalism. Anybody participating in this today would be arrested. People dressed up like Mohawk Indians, these Sons of Liberty, and they threw the tea into the harbor. And, you don't keep it. You're not stealing the tea. This is vandalism, people. But it is a massive scale of property damage, and estimated about $90,000 worth. That's a lot, all right? And what happens as a result is the Intolerable Acts. Now, the Intolerable Acts, they together institute martial law in the Massachusetts colony, military rule, essentially. And what happens here is that you've got the Minutemen who rally together. All right, now, of course, the Intolerable Acts, just in case, now, I don't have those listed because you may not run into those specifically on the EOC, but it's good to know what they are, okay? The Intolerable Acts, first of all, you've got the Boston Port Act, which closes the Port of Boston. All right, so the Boston port will be closed until it is paid for. And then the Massachusetts Government Act, which puts the colony under the direction of a royal governor. And this royal governor is a member of the military. He's a general. All right, so you've got that. And then you've got a quartering act. Now, this is another quartering act on top of one that had already been passed. And what this does is this allows the governor to find private buildings to put troops, because Massachusetts was not building quarters for the soldiers. They were not providing quarters for the soldiers like they were supposed to. All right? And I'm having a little bit of a Rick Perry moment. I know the Quebec Act. Oh, the Administration of Justice Act. And this is where British soldiers are going to be sent, and British officials are going to be sent back to the mother country for trial, which this is especially insulting to the colonists who had given the soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre a not guilty verdict. So British officials and soldiers are going to go back to Britain for trial. And then finally there's the Quebec Act, which is just kind of like icing on the cake, in which Quebec's territory is expanded and Catholicism is made the official religion. And this was a nod to the people of Quebec. So Quebec gets a little thumbs up, meanwhile Massachusetts gets a thumbs down. Now, of course, Quebec is not going to secede from the British Empire with the rest of the colonies. And then you've got these Minutemen. Now, the Minutemen called this because they're just shopkeepers and teachers and lawyers and farmers and bankers and regular people who are drilling. These are militia troops, and they are drilling regularly, and they are preparing for battle. Now, these people were typically engaged in defending against, frontier Indian attacks and that sort of thing if they were needed. But you start to get the picture that these Minutemen are drilling for another reason, that they're drilling because they want to fight the British. And the British get intimidated, and they send an army to go and confiscate the arsenal at Concord, all right, that the colonists had put together a store of arms, and the British are sent there to seize the arsenal and take it away so that the colonists can't defend themselves. And this is where the line is drawn, because this is an attack on the basic right of self-defense. And the colonists decide now it is the time to use violence. And this is the Old North Bridge, where you had this, this battle, the shot heard round the world and that sort of thing. And then there is Massachusetts, all right, which still, takes pride in this Minuteman heritage, even though they're called the Bay State, not the Minuteman State. But anyway, that's what leads us to the American Revolution. And in the next segment, which I hope you'll watch with us, we are going to get into the Declaration of Independence and all of the ins and outs of that. See you in a bit.